Let me give you a quote to start, James Boyce. A multifaceted defence of country, a transformation of the land, the introduction of foreign settlers and a confrontation between two worlds. Now, this might have been describing not the Fens in England, but Tasmania, where, James Boyce, you live. So maybe the question, which I know you get asked a lot, is not so much why you decided to write a history of the Fens in England, but how come it took so long?
Oh yeah, that is a different question, Rosemary. Yeah, well, the beginning of the book probably does go back to when I lived in Norwich in the late 1990s, when I was a social worker and working in sort of country Norfolk, not covering the Fens proper, which are part of Norfolk. The Fens proper spread across about 4 different counties of parts of Cambridgeshire, parts of Lincolnshire, parts of Cambridgeshire, sort of in eastern England, vast old wetland. But I thought I only had one book in me. I didn't see myself in those days as a writer or even as a historian. I had a book that was slowly growing in me over many years, which was about my home, about Tasmania. So I wasn't really thinking of doing other than, just learning a bit of the history of the country around where I was. But I discovered that my ancestors came from that area, and of course that added a layer of interest. But also, after I spent so many years researching Tasmanian history and then going on, looking at early Victoria, and when I was looking at the history of the Fens again, I was struck by the fact that the history was still being written in a way that we'd stopped writing Australian history quite a generation ago. It was still being written as if this process of drainage of this vast wetland and the remaking of the country, the eviction of the people, the local people, through what they call in England enclosure, which is where the common land becomes privatised. In the Fens, this went on over a couple of hundred years. Drainage went with enclosure, and they brought in new settlers, mainly Protestant refugees from Northern Europe, Huguenots, from France and Flanders. So the process, I just thought this is so similar to what we were experiencing. Obviously, there are differences. I don't want to push it too far. I mean, the Indigenous people of Australia's experience was a level of trauma that the local people and the Fens didn't have. It did make a difference, being white, being English, but also there were remarkable similarities. And the history was still being written, though, there, as if all this was inevitable. There might have been losses, we might lament the loss, but the progress of industry, the process of drainage, the process of dispossession, of enclosure, of development, of remaking the land, of remaking the people, this was what progress ultimately was. The agency of the people just seemed to have been being removed, and also their heroic resistance to the drainage. I became fascinated by that. I mean, for centuries they fought this drainage, and not only did they fight it, but in many areas they were successful. So the agency of the people was being lost in the history, and that's what we used to do to Aboriginal people. We used to write our history here. People of compassion and of heart have always written the story with some sadness. I mean, that's, but the Aboriginal people were just victims, of the inevitable victims of the force of history. There was nothing that ultimately could be done about this, and their agency was lost. the fact that they resisted, the fact that they adapted, they accommodated, and the fact that ultimately they survived and endured was lost. And so I wanted to look at the Fens history, learning from that experience of what we've learned in Australia, and see became the motivation of the book, really.
Well, you've certainly done that, and then you went way back to pre Henry VIII, who features as one of the as instrumental in the enclosure, the whole history of that. It's almost as though the English we become part of English history at this time when all that stuff that you've described was almost inevitable, because the people who sort of came out here, you suggest in your book, and not exactly, but they're partly the sort of people who are suffering from the history of enclosure. So if the fact that they landed here right at that time in that period in the 18th century when England, that's why you call the book Imperial Mud, I imagine.
Yeah, it's the parallels are remarkable. I mean, the process of enclosure in England, the loss of the common, and the dispossession of the ordinary people of England from their land, being made homeless in their own country, in effect, by enclosure. I mean, it's a remarkable and turbulent and traumatic process that goes on for a couple of centuries, and it's particularly marked and painful in the Fens because almost the whole region is common land. Almost the whole area is this rich, bountiful wetland common with abundant summer pastures. So that when enclosure happens and this area is drained and turned into these neat farms with imported tenant farmers, it really is like a process of colonialism going on backed by the central state, by the increasing power of the centralised state. And yes, these people, the links with the process of imperialism that's happening internally within Britain. I mean, a lot of people know the story of the Scottish Highlands and the story of Ireland, but it's also happening in these places within England itself. Mm-hmm. People are made homeless in their own land, and a lot of them are moving into the cities of England, in the early Industrial Revolution. But also they've been spread across the empire, both as soldiers and as settlers and as convicts. They're not always in the immediate generation. Like if you look at a lot of the convicts, of course, as we know, come from an urban background. Not all, but a very large proportion of them. But if you go back often with those convicts, you go back one or usually just their parent generation or some of the second generation, you'll see the villages where they've come from and the impact of enclosure on their life. I mean, it's what the enclosure does is create this highly mobile population that is dependent on the vagary of the early industrial economy, and those people are very vulnerable, and a lot of them become small-scale criminals and get caught up in that system, which of course are our early convict population. But others become settlers, others become the working class of England, the industrial cities. So enclosure is tied up. This process of enclosure, dispossession, the loss of the common is part of the story of empire, and part of the story of the growth of industry and the industrial revolution, which is tied up with empire as well. So yeah, it's all very much interconnected. And what I would suggest in the book is that while that's often acknowledged or widely acknowledged, often sort of enclosure is often seen as a sort of precursor to imperialism. There's sort of something that lays of the overseas empire. But I think what I'm trying to argue in the book is that it's actually much messier than that even. I mean, it's all going on at once. Coincident, because this year is an anniversary that we're not remembering as much in Australia, but in North America is very big. It's the 400th anniversary of the departure of the Mayflower, the famous Pilgrim Fathers from England, left in 1620. And as they were leaving, you know, as these Calvinist settlers were leaving, seeking a level of religious freedom in North America, this celebrated immigration that is so close to the American national identity ever since. There were settlers arriving into the Fens who were also Calvinist refugees to colonise, being brought in, also seeking religious freedom, also evicting the local people, also seeking to civilise and redeem the land, and you know, and seeking a new society, coming into eastern England around the port of Boston, which is not where the Mayflower departed, but where which is very much associated with the Puritan exodus. So, you know, Boston is the main port town of the Fens, and so within miles of Boston, land and people, this process of empire was going on within England itself. And I think that's, I mean, I'm careful. I do think we have to be careful I don't want to say, well, you know, the English suffered just as much as the Native Americans or Aboriginal Australians. I mean, that would be a trite thing to say, because obviously, you know, we know the level of the sheer level of loss, of death, you know, just at that level of disruption to community life, of the impact of conquest was greater than it was in England. But it is important to be, you know, it is remarkable when you look at the experience of the people. There's some of the parallels here, and it reminds us that the source of a lot of these problems lies in how people were seeing other people, you know, how they were seeing the land, how they were seeing the attitudes that they were coming in from, and the increasing power of the centralised state, the increasing power of capital, and the whole perception of what Christianity meant, what civilization meant, what redemption meant. I mean, there's all these things that played out so tragically in our home were also being played out within England itself.
Now I can see some links with some of your other work, and of course you make a case. Well, you explain to us about the common land and commoners. It wasn't just about sharing land; it was about sharing ideas and attitudes to the people as well as the land.
Yeah, and again, I think, Rosemary, I mean, this sounds a bit arrogant, so I'm not quite sure how the right way to word it, but I think being an Australian looking into English history helped here, because some of the things we take for granted are actually not taken for granted in sort of highly educated worlds in England. And one of them is we understand here, we glimpse anyway. I mean, understanding is too strong a word, but we know that Aboriginal understandings of connection with land, understanding of what land meant, what understanding of land ownership meant, it's very different from ours. We know that, and we know that it's about connection to country. Even that term, connection to country, is something that's now part of Australian culture. I discovered that the English editors and other readers of the book didn't know what I had that right through the book initially, because what the commoners had was something more akin to connection to country, the modern understandings of land ownership. So the common system's often misunderstood today, but the commons in England was not about who owned the land. So just as the British put up a flag here saying this land is now owned by the British Crown or something, the Norman invaders had done the same thing in England back in 1066 and all that. They put up, so this is now our land. So the land all formally belonged to someone. They then handed it out to favoured lords. The commons was quite different from that. The commons is it, which is quite different from the ownership of the land. So the right to fish it, graze it, hunt it. But it's more than that again. It's the commoners, it was their country in a way that is not just, it cannot easily be defined by a court. It's where they lived and belonged and they had their relationships. And it's more like an indigenous way of being. It's a different consciousness. Your country is part of you. And that's what the commoners had as well. So when I was coming into writing the book and talking about the commons, and I think as Australian historians, we sort of have a bit of a head start with that. We know we're dealing with another world, another way of being, another form of consciousness, another worldview, and it's quite difficult to write about that. It's quite, and in fact, it's impossible really to communicate that depth of mystery and wonder that's encapsulated in that. But that form of relationship with land has been what most human beings through most of history have had. And part of course, the great sort of loneliness of the modern Western spirit, that we're all struggling with, is the loss of that. And that's what we've lost with the commons. So that was what the commons was about. It was not just a legal set of rights. So, you've got the right to fish this time, or you've got the right to walk through this bit of land, or you've got the right to graze or hunt, which is what the courts tended to reduce common rights to before, if they, and then when they were enclosed, they were extinguished altogether. So the enclosure in England doesn't just mean putting up a fence or a hedgerow. It meant a legal process to extinguish all common rights and replace that with what we now understand by private property. The owner has all rights, exclusive rights to the land. And this struggle, by the way, was played out in Australia, because the idea of the common, the idea of what land meant, wasn't all fixed yet. It was being contested in England still, and some of that contest was transferred into Australia. So there's sort of more parallels there as well. Yeah, again, sort of quite impertinently invent the term, because we didn't have a term to describe shared identity. I mean, the people of Fens, again, like Aboriginal people identity, sort of say, for example, the Tasmanian Aboriginal identity comes as a result of invasion and conquest and dispossession. We get, different language groups, different people with, who define themselves by, different nations, essentially, develop a common identity because they were experiencing the common experience of dispossession and from an invasion. And it was a bit like that with the people of the Fens. Their primary identity is their local village, their local commons, their local patch of earth. But as the dispossession, the drainage process goes on, they develop this shared identity, and they didn't have a name for it other than Fen Men. That was still being used, the name Fen Men, which for obvious reasons is extraordinarily limiting. So I invented the word Fenish to describe that shared experience, that shared identity that emerged as a result of this process of invasion and conquest. This is remarkable feature, actually. We get really offended, and rightly so, when we read some of the descriptions of Aboriginal people in the 18th and 19th centuries, or well into the 20th century, even today, sadly, some places, sometimes. And I don't know whether it's but it is a feature of, it is quite remarkable that it happens whenever dispossession is going on. And so the denigration of the people of the Fens, these becomes so pronounced when they're trying to take their land, when they're draining the land, and these people are resisting it and fighting it and saying, no, we want to keep the wetland. This is incredibly abundant wetlands. I mean, we think wetlands are not sort of barren swamps. There's some of the most, it's not by chance that most human civilizations, the great civilizations that we think of, emerged in wetlands. In the Nile, the Euphrates, the Andes, and this is because these places are full of rich, diverse foodstuffs, predictable foodstuffs through the year, and they combine well with farm. You know, because often, you know, like in the Fens, when the winter flooding would recede, that, and then you'd be left with these fertilised, rich summer pastures for stock. You know, and in Melbourne, you know, Melbourne was the reasons why the mouth of the Yarra there was chosen by the British and was so heavily populated and favoured by Aboriginal people was because of the wetland on the south side. There's so many different ecosystems you have, and so this wetland area of England was actually very rich. And you know, people who go there today will see in the little hills. It's all pretty much at sea level, or these days below sea level. Yeah, because of the. I mean, that's another story. But I mean, historically, it was at or just above sea level. And then you have these little areas that are just above sea level where they built the villages. And with so much wealth coming out of the area. That you can still see. You can see it in the quality, you know, the standard of the churches and Ely Cathedral. I mean, some people will know that's in the Fens. So this was a very rich area in the 16th century, one of the richest parts of England. So people are not being dispossessed because there's some sort of failure of their economic system, or that it's because they want to move to a privatised system. A certain group of people want to appropriate all that wealth for themselves through enclosure and dispossession. And so how do you do that? How do you show? You have to claim that these people are sort of savages, really. Like the Native American people, like the Aboriginal people. Compare them with them. And the process, it's a justification of the taking of the land, which of course, and even then you pretend, like we did in Australia, the greatest lie of all, this process is actually good for you. Because not only we might be taking your land, making you homeless, locking you in jail or whatever, but we're actually civilising you. We're bringing you a gift, and so that is exactly what happens in the Fens as well. And it's quite, and you can see it in the Fens, interestingly, and also as you can see it in Australia. I mean, if there's it's not by chance that, say, the French explorers are much more positive about Aboriginal people, because they're not trying to take the land. It's not only about the French being, you know, enlightened or having a different attitude than the British. It's because the French are just visiting. And the same in the Fens, like there's big monastic houses, big monastic landholders who benefit from the commons, because the commoners, they have a sort of symbiotic relationship up until the Reformation, when you referred to Henry VIII before, and they write quite positively about the local people, because they're in a symbiotic relationship, trading relationship. You know, they get their rent, the local people, in return for the protection of these big monastic houses, are giving them, are paying them heavy rents in eels and other products each year. Fish, feeding these large monastic establishments, and they're very positive about the local people and the wealth of the area and the economy and the systems of land use. And it's only with enclosure, when the move to enclosure, the move to take the land, the move to privatise the land, the move to drain the land, that the local people become these denigrated, savages, clinging onto a semi-sewage way of life. And so, it's close parallels again to what we see in Australia and other parts of the New World.
And I tell you what else I reckon was PR, and when you think of England, you think of all those neat squares, I think you mentioned before, of the different coloured crops and stuff. I reckon there's an aesthetic that comes, because when you quote Charles Kingsley, of all people, writing about the Fens, some people will remember Water Babies, which has fallen out of favour because it's racist, apparently.
Yes.
It's a long time since I read it. But
Yeah,
I
me
reckon,
too.
I reckon what happened was, you know, we started encouraging writers and rewarding writers who described that incredibly neat England, you know, rather than the beautiful. When Kingsley writes about the Fens, gosh, it's nature writing. That's really very, very beautiful. So writing itself changed about the Fens as well, and the description. Do you think, as you've read a lot of this, I assume?
Yeah, I think I was amazed by the loss of cultural memory of what the Fens was. It's parallel a bit. I think of it in Australia. I think the parallel is the degree to which we've forgotten what the grasslands were. You know, like in your part of the world and north and west of Melbourne, but it's, you know, much of eastern Australia. This extraordinarily rich, beautiful, diverse lowland grasslands, which are now the most threatened ecosystem in Australia. I mean, Tasmania, we think of Tasmania as preserving natural habitat. Less than 1%, tiny percent of the old lowland grasslands that used to stretch between here and Launceston on the left. It's a extremely threatened ecosystem, and even those little remnants that are left don't give us a real picture of it. And our cultural memory's been forgotten about it, and it's partly because paintings, you know, can capture the vistas, the big landscape, but, you know, they can't capture looking into a square metre and seeing 50 different species, birds and flowers, and the sheer wonder of the richness of this grassland, which is so different from our sort of grasslands today, and also different from the native grasslands of sort of high region, you know, the less fertile soils. So and in a similar way to this sort of cultural forgetting has happened with the Fens, but it's even more surprising there in a way, given that it was quite a dramatic landscape, and it's the last big lowland wilderness, if you like, of England, and it had the largest lake by surface area, that it was only drained in the 1850s, and that's what Kingsley was writing about, Whittlesea Mere. Yet most people in England would never have heard of Whittlesea Mere, and here it was, this vast wonderland that was only lost, you know, 150 years ago. I think a couple of things came into play that occurred to me. One was that it happened just before photography. So that didn't help. But the other thing that happened, I think, it sort of, where's the Lake District in England that people will have heard, you know, with Wordsworth, and that became very celebrated and part of the nature conservation movement to protect this. It was a wilderness area as well. I mean, I'm using the term wilderness not as in the sense of no people, but as in wild places, managed landscapes, human landscapes, as the wilderness was in Australia. The Lake District becomes celebrated because it's got mountains and dramatic scenery, but wetlands and swamps have a much more complex past in our culture. You know, it's taken us a while to appreciate them, and Whittlesea Mere wasn't like the Derwentwater or some of the big lakes in the Lake District. It wasn't like Switzerland, you know, sort of alpine magnificence. These are the beauty. These are wetlands which come and go according to the waters, that are quite shallow, that there's lots of reeds, there's lots of mud, you know, around them, inaccessibility. And for the people who are sort of wanting a certain type of English landscape, a certain sensibility, and all the baggage that came with that, took a while to learn the appreciation of them, but it does start to happen, and you see it in a number of writings towards the end of the 19th century, but it's almost too late. There is appreciation of it, funnily enough, in the Middle Ages. Again, when the bounty of the land is being valued and appreciated, and the wealth of the land, they tended to appreciate the beauty of the land. And when they wanted to do something else with the land, it needed to be improved and the land remade beautiful. There is one other factor, is malaria, which we forget about in England. We tend to think of malaria again as sort of imperial arrogance. That's not something the English had. That's something that that was part of the colonial experience or something. But in fact, malaria is a very big part in the history of Europe, and including of England. And the Fens was known for its malaria, they called ague, and that really didn't die out fully. I mean, it got less through the 19th century with drainage, and disappeared only really sort of well into the 19th century. So that was associated. They associated it with fevers. They didn't understand it was from the mosquito, but they knew that it was associated with swamps, and the local people had a level of resistance to it. So in a way, it was a friend of the poor, because it kept out for many centuries a lot of people who might have otherwise wanted to come in and claim that land earlier. But I think that too. So there was a complex relationship with wetlands, in other words, and that's which we still have today. Actually, I mean, we're still working, aren't we, to get over that some of that's prejudices really against the swamp, and that goes right back into early mythology. You can find sort of anti-swamp message, sort of swamp prejudice in Western culture, which is probably to do with the prevalence of malaria and other illnesses.
You got into a bit of trouble heading out to Whittlesea Mere, didn't you, James?
Yeah, the camp by Whittlesea Mere. Oh yeah, there's a wonderful project out there, Rosemary. It's really quite moving now, because well over 99% of the old Fens is drained, lost. And it's a remarkable landscape to visit. I mean, it's not really on the tourist agenda because it's so flat. It's the most heavily farmed part of England. It's intense industrial agriculture of cropping, because the soil was this rich peat, incredibly deep peat that you could grow anything on for a while. But the problem is, when peat is exposed to the air, to oxygen, it decomposes. And so these sort of engineers from the 17th century on didn't know what they'd got into, because they brought in the Dutch, but actually it turned out to be the Dutch could drain it, but they couldn't keep it dry, because the peat, unlike in a much bigger problem than they had in Holland in this way, the peat would decompose, and so it continued to sink. So of course the windmills, they bring the windmills and they try and pump it. The more successful you were with the drainage, the greater the problem became, and so the waters are sort of constantly creeping back in, and so part of the defence of the land is not just the local people digging up the ditches, destroying the drainage works, and conducting a sort of guerrilla warfare really against the drainage project over many centuries. It's also the land itself is fighting back. And really it's only with the coming of steam power in the 19th century, the steam engine, that they win this fight, or they think they've won the fight. I mean, we could get into that later now. It's all becoming much more complicated now, because the land is so low now. I mean, you can walk in parts of it and you look 2 metres above your head. You can't see the water in the rivers. It's flowing above, and that water, of course, is having to be pumped up. High energy use, you've got to be removed, and and this great, rich, wonderful peat soil is getting less and less, so the fertility of the soil is going down and the cost of pumping is going up. And of course, we've got sea level rise and all these things going on. So what you have at Whittle, so when I visited and walking around this remarkable landscape, I mean, the villages are obviously intact and beautiful, and it's interesting and complex, and there's still some power in the land and connection with the land that you get from just walking and sleeping it. But I wanted very much to go to Whittlesea Mere and spend time there, partly because to pay homage to this lost lake. I mean, as a Tasmanian, of course, we live with the loss of Lake Pedder, and we live with that, and there's a group of people, Christine Milne and others, who are working to reclaim Pedder, which is quite not that is a very realistic prospect if we choose to do that, because it's also it's quite a shallow lake. The area of the dam is, and the old lake apparently is still under there, even with its beach. But we live with the loss of Lake Pedder in the early 70s. It's part of growing up Tasmanian. Is this lost lake, and I suppose for Whittlesea Mere became for me in this area a bit like that. There's this lost lake. I wanted to see where it was in the land, and it is now above. It can never be reclaimed because it was a silt base, and all the land around was the peat. The land around the lake, the old lake, is now much lower than the lake bed. The lake bed is the highland, which is a paradox. But there's a terrific coalition of local environmental groups under the umbrella. It's called the Great Fen Project, who are working to restore just a small percentage of the lost fen. And Whittlesea Mere, the old side of Whittlesea Mere, is part of that. So when I was camping, I just pulled up and went in and part of there, spent a few days camping, a couple of days camping in there. But when I came back, there was I was met by a policeman and the land manager at the car, and I just thought I was being done for trespass for sure, And I was ready to make my apologies and live with whatever the consequences. But they were lovely people, and they were just worried that this, they'd been contacting the hire car company and my family, everything, worried that, of course, that there'd been some sort of personal, I was in mental health problem,
Yes,
and they were lovely people. And then they showed me around. The land manager spent the day with me, showing me around the Great Fen Project and the work they're doing. And it's really beautiful, and it's one of those. It's the story of the Fens is not over. The connection to country goes on, and what they have to do there. Similar to what we're doing in Australia with fire management and how to manage this environment, is reconnecting with Indigenous knowledge, and it's very central to the Great Fens Project, because you can't just restore. The nature and humans there go back to the beginning, like they do here. It's not one or the other, and it's learning how we live in this landscape. And so there, it's very important that the reeds get cut. Very important that areas get grazed. Otherwise you don't have this diversity of species. And so they're going back through records. They're talking to old people. They're doing all the trying to learn and learn how to be in this land and reclaim and restore. But having to do that in the 21st century. So it's very inspiring in a way, and also having to do it, of course, in the context of rising sea levels and all the other challenges that we also face with global heating here.
Yep. Hopeful glimpses, I think. We should mention before we leave you, James Boyce, that there was a James Boyce who you don't think is related to, but on your mother's side, they're the Peat family, which I think is hilarious. It's probably. Do you think it's a different spelling of P-E-A-T? Do you think?
Yeah. Well, lost Westerners like myself, always longing to belong somewhere, Rose. deeply. I think a lot of my work is about searching for home and belonging. And my mum and my father's ancestors, I probably am related actually to James Boyce, because James Boyce, well, I should explain, was one of the ones who defended the area of Whittlesea and the enclosures and the drainage in the 17th century. The story's quite exciting in that it gets tangled up in the Civil War, but it's a story for another day if people read the book. But Oliver Cromwell was from the Fens, and the Civil War is a real feature. And I mean, one area they push back the enclosures and the drainers and hold on to the wetland for a century in the Civil War. But parts of Cambridgeshire are drained in the Civil War, and it's all caught up in the fighting. And Whittlesea Mere is part of that. And one of the leading defenders is the Boyce family. And James Boyce gets sent off to the Tower of London for his role in trying to destroy drainage works and I think the violence to some of the troops sent in. I mean, the army's used in this area. People die in this fighting. So yeah, he gets sent to the Tower for a while. And I did in earlier chapters, it was quite surreal reading about James Boyce, knowing that all my family ancestors are from exactly that area. So we're probably. But what is humbling, and the peats are from southern Lincolnshire, but it's not from the peat soil. It's probably from the Dutch, from the Flemish name.
Of course.
And also the Boyces is Dubois. So we're probably, as we all probably are, we're from people from that part of the world. We're a mixture of belonging colonisers. I'm my stock, Dubois, Protestant refugees. I'm probably part of the settlers of that country, part of the colonisers, as well as no doubt having family links that go further back. We're all a motley crew, aren't we, Rosemary?
We are indeed.
And trying to find our connection to Earth and our belonging, and I think there's enormous connections though across geography. And I think for me, if we want to find those global themes, I mean, I've been thinking about this not so much when I was writing the book, but I've been having some conversations about it with Christine Milne, who's going to be launching the book in Hobart in next month, and it's made me realise that I, in terms of responding to the environmental crisis, I mean, it's such a crisis, isn't it, we're dealing with? I mean, it's really overwhelmingly urgent that some of the global histories that are written, the big picture histories, I find them almost disempowering because there's such a determinism about it, like Guns, Germ, Steel by Jared Diamond, these great big forces of history that sweep over us. And we're sort of like little human beings are sort of powerless in the face of this. And I think that's why I'm being drawn to local regional history, why I wanted to, study, Tasmania, and at the moment I'm doing early Sydney, Melbourne, I did the Fens, is because you find there that in fact people have always cared for their land. People have always had relationship with land. People have had, the local people's relationship with land is far more complex and multi-layered than these big global histories can present. And so ironically, I think you can get into the big picture, the experience of humans in land through local and regional history, through their story, through the stories of particular places. You can get into the big picture more effectively than you can in the global history, where you seem to end up talking about these forces that are bigger than human beings.